loyal supporter of the Freedom Association, he has had to sit through endless and numerous speeches of introduction from me. So I'm going to keep this one exceptionally short. And I simply want to say this, and it's something I feel very strongly about. In my opinion, of all the Brexiteers, of all the people over the years who've campaigned for Brexit, to me, Dan is the absolute embodiment of all that is best of our cause. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Daniel Hannan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And Simon, thank you very much for your kind words. I won't call you my old friend in view of what's just happened. I'll call you my long-standing friend. And it's great to be among so many long-standing friends here. The first political act of my life was to join this association in 1988, when I was 17. And it was that moment when the Freedom Association was just beginning to run with this new concept and this newfangled word called Euroscepticism. You'll remember that Maurice McWhirter was one of the first people to begin to campaign for a recovery of our national independence. For a long time, you had the field pretty much to yourself. Well, you caught me, as it were, at an impressionable age. Who knows what would have happened had I joined a different outfit. And I then spent the next nearly 3 decades campaigning to recover our national self-government. I'd have looked a bit silly if it had gone the other way, wouldn't I? I have my younger daughter Allegra here. Her elder sister phoned my wife on the day of the referendum and said, if he loses, Danny would have wasted his whole life. Harsh but true. I well remember, as you will, the 23rd of June 2016. It was a day rather like this, a not untypical English June day, overcast and damp. Hedgerows were thick and rank with June, the grass was in seed, the cow parsley and the nettles were tall against the grey sky. There was no premonition of what was coming. I remember waking up in a cheerful mood, and after doing the early get out the votes, taking my wife to our polling station in our little Hampshire village. And opposite the polling station, somebody had parked a jeep with the most immense vote leave poster on a trailer. And my mood began to lift. And as I went into the polling station, an awful lot of local residents were catching my eye and smiling, and in some cases raising their thumbs. And then I filled in the ballot paper, thinking of Allegra and her little sister, and her yet, at that stage, unborn brother. And I felt as cheerful as I have about anything in my life. I kissed my heavily pregnant wife, we held hands, and I walked out into the long June day. And at that stage, nobody saw what was coming. For once, the phrase "against all the odds" is literally accurate. The bookies' odds on that morning translated into a probability of an 82% remain. Silly odds to give in any two-horse race. That was the view. And later that day it started raining heavily. I had great pleasure on Twitter following all the accounts of the angry young Remainers who couldn't get home to vote because of the floods at Waterloo Station. And I came to London still with my mood rising, even as the barometer fell, because I'd been getting reports from our teams who'd been out and actually doing the knocking up operation since the previous Saturday. And then when the count began, we got a text from the chief pollster for the Remain side, who texted his equivalent number on our side in the vote leave office, and said, "We've won 60-40, and added some words that I won't repeat in front of my lawyer. That was how confident they were. And then you can all remember the wonderful moment when the results started coming. I was watching in the Vote Leave office, and I tell you, when we saw the result from Sunderland, you could have heard our cheers. And that was the achievement, above all, of this association, which long before the others joined in, before the Bruges Group existed, before UKIP had been thought of, was the organisation out there making the argument. So tonight, at last, I get the chance to say to you, job well done. As we say, we old Brussels hands, mission accomplie. And then the next morning, perhaps unsurprising, given the magnitude of what had happened, I don't know about you, I felt slightly shell-shocked. I mean, let alone what the losers were feeling. I remember, if you remember, it was an appropriately beautiful, bright, blazing orange morning. And I remember feeling a sense of almost disorientation. Funny, because I hadn't been to bed for about 3 days, but it was mainly at the sheer wonder of what was taking place. And I now realise that sense of shock was the mildly vertiginous feeling of being back in control, of having set aside, politely but firmly, all of the assumptions that our entire political class had placed before us for the previous 4.5 days. Saying to them, no thank you, we're going to order off a different menu. It can be a feeling of shell shock. It's the shell shock of the prisoner, long incarcerated, told what time to eat and rise and sleep, who suddenly is paroled and finds he has to make his own decisions. It's the shock of the convalescent, confined for weeks to his bed, who one day is able to cross the floor and throw open the French windows and stride out into the blue skies and meadows outside. It's a thrill, but it is a little bit daunting. Well, here we are a year on. How are we to explain what happened? I think you could do a lot worse than look at what's around us in this city and consider the story of our island nation through the story of Poland. We're a maritime people, bound in with the triumphant sea, as our national poet puts it, whose envious siege, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune. We're defined by being a maritime people, merchant people, an adventurous people, a people looking outwards to other lands. It was from this city, first of all, that Wolfe left to conquer Quebec. Like Nelson, he died at the moment of his triumph, and like Nelson, his body was brought back here. It was from this city that Captain Bligh went off on his voyages of discovery. It was from here that Cook settled Australia, or made the initial trip that led to the settlement of Australia. Portsmouth has the unusual distinction of being bombed in both wars. It was bombed by Zeppelin in the First World War, and then it was repeatedly bombed by the Luftwaffe in the Second. And then, of course, it was from here, or largely from here, that the greatest military expedition of all time was launched. It was not far from here that Eisenhower addressed the troops on the eve of D-Day. A battle, of course, that secured our independence, but also one that liberated every other friendly nation in Europe and restored the principle of national self-determination to a continent where it had been lost. What does that walk through Portsmouth's history tell you? Well, first of all, it reminds us that we are not a continental country. You know who saw this really clearly? Mary's countryman, General de Gaulle. When he issued one of his two famous vetoes, he explained it in language that we resented at the time, but I think showed a surer grasp of our national character than some of our own leaders. He said, Britain will never be European because Britain will always be drawn to the open sea, or he always put it, the open main, the Grand Large. He went on to say, England, he always called us England, is by its nature maritime and insular, connected by her interactions, by her commerce, and by her supply lines to the most distant and diverse of countries. That's why he said she can never accept a common tariff and a European destiny. I think the coverage, you will all be far too young to remember de Gaulle's vetoes, with the possible exception of Sir Mark. The rest of you but the coverage at the time was very resentful. You know, the feeling was that he'd been very ungrateful, that he wasn't paying back an ally very fairly, but actually he was onto, I mean, looking back, who can doubt that he was onto something? We were never comfortable in a project which aspired to turn Europe into a single country. The European problem, in a sense for us, or the British problem, if you look at it from Europe, can be very easily summarised. We wanted a common market, we didn't want a common government. That's why we didn't join in the first place, that's why de Gaulle vetoed us. We had to then lie about that, or our leaders had to lie about it when we came in. But from the moment of Maastricht, when it was clear that the EU was no longer an association of states, but was becoming a superstate, it became inevitable that we would seek a different dispensation. Had David Cameron been able to get one from the inside? Had that renegotiation resulted in a significant retrieval of power? Who can doubt that he'd have won? But therefore, we have to seek it from the outside. Which brings us to the second thing that little walk through Portsmouth tells us. This is a country that values independence, not only for itself, but for every friendly country. We display that highest form of patriotism, which is a concern for the liberty of other peoples. And that surely is what we were fighting for at Trafalgar. Everybody quotes, in fact it's at the back of your menu, the most famous quote arguably in the English language, the signal that Nelson ran up, England expects. Actually, he began England confides, but the man in charge of the flags corrected him, or edited him. It would have been a much less memorable quotation. Actually, the quotation was always forgotten, but I think it's much more appropriate, because it's apt to our national character in its sardonic and laconic form, is Admiral Collingwood's reply. Does everyone know this? Admiral Collingwood said, "I do wish Nelson would stop signalling. We all know what to do." Very great man, and indeed old boy of Newcastle Grammar. But the less, I think that the apter Nelson quotation is not England expects, but it's the one that appears at the beginning of your little menus here. Now, I don't know if you all saw his bedroom on HMS Victory. On the morning of the battle, the ship had been cleared, so all the furniture had been taken out, everything was ready for battle. But a couple of screens were erected to give him a little bit of privacy. And he still had a little writing desk there, and he knelt and he wrote the prayer that appears here. May the great God, whom I worship, grant to my nation and for the benefit of Europe in general, a great and glorious victory. And for the benefit of Europe in general. We were fighting not just for our right to live under our own laws and our own institutions. We were fighting for the independence of the Dutch and the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians and our oldest allies, the Portuguese. We were fighting for a restoration of the principle that each country should choose its own leaders and live under its own parliament and its own people. And who can doubt that that has been the best and surest principle on which to organise human affairs? The alternative against which Nelson was making war was the organisation of the entire European continent into what Bonaparte called the continental system. Bureaucratic, dirigiste, military dictatorship which treated the entire continent of Europe as a single entity. It wasn't the last time that Britain was called on to restore the national principle to neighbouring countries. On 2 occasions in the last 100 years, we embarked on ruinous wars, expensive, destructive, draining wars, not because we had been attacked, but because the sovereignty of a friendly country had been violated. And we again displayed that highest form of patriotism, which is a concern for the liberty of friendly peoples. We of all nations need no lessons about being good Europeans. The victory of the English-speaking peoples, there would have been no European Union, no European construction. Europe would have been united, but not through voluntarism or democracy. And that's why, however we assess the vote of last year, let's for heaven's sake remember the essentially internationalist and optimistic message that we brought to the polls. We were not voting out of fear, out of nostalgia, out of rage at the modern world. We were not voting as a country that is nervous, unsure of itself, but au contraire, we were voting as a great nation that knows that it still has more to give, and that understands that we've outgrown a small regional construct, and that we need to engage with more distant horizons and more opulent markets overseas. We're 1 year on today. How's it working out? How have things unfolded? How does it match what the two sides told us would happen during the campaign? There's a lovely line that I always think is the essence of conservatism that came from Edmund Burke when he was writing about the French Revolution. I just think this is the most beautiful explanation of what happened 365 days ago. He said, because half a dozen grasshoppers concealed under a fir make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle take their repose beneath the shade of the British oak and chew the cud in silence. Pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the kingdom. Now, what we saw on the 23rd of June last year is not only that the oxen are far more numerous and powerful than the little crickets, but that they were right. The experts were wrong. All of those angry millennials complaining about that, you know what, maybe your granny knew a thing or two. Maybe it would have been wise to pay some attention. Just think about it. We were told, if we vote to leave, first thing, the Calais jungle will be moved to Kent and we'll lose all cooperation on borders with our European allies. What actually happened? 6 weeks after the vote, the Calais jungle was dismantled. It doesn't exist anymore. We were told, if you vote to leave, Scotland will walk out of the United Kingdom. What's happened? Support for separatism has plummeted, and Nicola Sturgeon has accepted that there will now not be. And then we got to the real lies about what would happen to our economy, the £4,000 that we'd have all paid by now. We were told that unemployment would rise by 9,000 a month for the rest of 2016. It in fact fell by almost exactly that amount and is now at a record low. We were told that if we voted leave, there would be a technical recession in 2016. In other words, 2 quarters of successive negative growth. In fact, we grew faster in the 6 months after the vote than we had in the 6 months leading up to the vote, and closed 2016 as the most successful major economy in the world. We were told that if we voted to leave, our pensions would lose their value because the stock exchange would collapse. Well, the only stock exchange that didn't collapse in Europe was ours. The FTSE turned into the most successful in this region. British stocks have outperformed every other stock exchange in Europe. In fact, you can measure this in any way. The only prediction that the other side made that was true, the only one, is that there was a correction, a long overdue correction, in the value of our currency. On every other measure, we're better off now than we were. Exports are up, manufacturing output is up, consumer confidence is up, retail sales are up, jobs are up, growth are up, investment is up. There's a lovely headline on about page 18 of the Financial Times last week saying foreign direct investment has actually grown since the vote, right? In other words, every front page we've run for the last 11 months has been nonsense. But of course, you won't hear that from people who are determined to see only bad news. And I have to say, the thing that has most upset me about the reaction to the vote, we can all make mistakes. Economists always make mistakes, that's what they do. But it's the wanting failure that I find hard to do. The way in which people gleefully repeat every prediction of bad news, while ignoring all the hard empirical data of good news, because they actually wish to inflict penury on their fellow countrymen so as to be able to say, I told you so. Some rude things were said about our side during the referendum. No doubt there are some people on our side who deserve it, because with 17.4 million Leave voters, they weren't all going to be safe. That's inevitable in the numbers. But I'm glad to say I didn't come across any Leavers who wanted this country to fail. And it is shocking that there are people, even now, a year after the result, who are still glorying in predictions of economic catastrophe. How much do you have to disdain your fellow country to wish poverty on them in order to make it point? After a successful year, what next? What's our future? How do the Brexit talks go from here? How do we maximise our opportunities and optimise our situation? Let me say something that I think it needs to be said more often. We are disproportionately focused on the deal that we're going to get with the rest of the EU. And perhaps inevitably. Our media talk of little else, all this, is it going to be a hard or a soft Brexit? Are they going to be punitive or cordial? And, frankly, I think that story is fairly likely to write itself. Never underestimate the power in politics of inertia bias. This is the first ever trade negotiation where you're beginning from a position of zero tariffs and complete regulatory equivalence. So the usual difficulty that you have in negotiations, which is the status quo bias, the ability of people to make a decent living out of the established dispensation, that actually works in a liberalising direction. I'm less interested in what deal we get with the 27 remaining EU members than in what deals we can now get with the 165 non-EU countries which will do a similar approximation. Now, my friends, we have the opportunity to do something big and bold and beautiful. We can become the first big country properly to open its markets. If you like, retrospectively to vindicate the old general at Colombe-les Deux Églises. Colombe-les Deux Mosques, as it now is. And become that global country connected once again by its supply lines to every continent and archipelago. One or two countries in the world have taken the bold step of opening their markets across the board. Food, textiles, and so on. They've never looked back. It's never, ever a bad thing to do. The Singaporeans did it, the Hong Kongers did it. When Singapore was independent, their income per head was half of what ours was in 1960. Now it's twice. Twice. This is in a place where there are no natural resources whatever. They even have to import their drinking water. How did they do it? How did they go from being a steaming, mosquito-infested tropical swamp into being this gleaming city-state? They stopped imposing tariffs, quotas, or restrictions on any imports. That was it. Everything else followed. Hong Kong, the same thing. Then more recently, New Zealand. Now Australia. Nobody ever looks back. But I hope that any Hong Kongers or New Zealanders present will not take it amiss if I say that liberalisation in those countries has had only a slight impact on the world economy. There are 4 million people in New Zealand. Although they're now doing fantastically well, it's had only a small dent on surrounding countries. 65 million Brits doing the same thing. That's transformed. We can become the first G7 country to become a true global trading power. That's a huge opportunity. I'm so disappointed in a way that we've squandered so many opportunities in the last year to talk of the positive advantages of Brexit. Yeah. We're so focused on rebutting myths and saying that it won't be as bad and that this won't happen. We are becoming, once again, a sovereign nation in charge of our own borders, our own money, our own laws, and above all, our own Well, though, if we're going to make a success of being a global trading power, we're going to have to need the domestic reforms to match. I'll tell you something there that I didn't say during the campaign, and that nobody said during the campaign, for obvious reasons, but which is nonetheless true. How much we succeed or fail from here is about 5% to do with what deal we get with the EU, and is 95% to do with what domestic reforms we undertake ourselves. If, as a country, we decide to have lower and flatter and simpler taxes, if we decide to have lighter regulations, if we decide to have truly free trade, if we have strong property rights and strong institutions, then we will prosper. And if we don't do those things, then Brexit is not going to save us. No. This is, if you like, the whole purpose of the referendum. We have taken back responsibility. But that now imposes on us the responsibility to be responsible. We have to live up to our new powers. And I have to say, here I'm not exactly as sanguine as I thought I would be. I can't help looking at the new Queen's speech and seeing that they've taken out all of the measures that would have got on top of spending and left in all of the ones that are pushing it up. I don't yet see that we have the strategic vision to become the kind of lithe and competitive economy that we could be as an offshore competitor to a sclerotic and over-regulated European Union. So we have arguments to win. When I said mission accomplie earlier, that doesn't mean that you should pack up and close down the Freedom Association. But it means that we need to focus now on how we make our domestic economy the place where everybody wants to come and do business. Yeah. We have the opportunity, and it's up to us to seize it. Let me finish on an optimistic note. Let me finish in a way where I started. What an extraordinary privilege it is for us to be in a position to take these decisions ourselves. Think of all those previous generations who had to defend with force of arms our right to live under our own parliamentarians in our own sovereign democracy. All we had to do was go and cast a vote. One of the many soldiers who passed through this city during the Second World War was my late father. He volunteered in 1944. He saw action in Italy, and before that in North Africa. He was prepared to defend physically, with coercive force, our right to be an independent country. Well, when I kissed my pregnant wife on the day of the vote, you'll have gathered that by now, maths being maths, and this being a year on, we have a little baby boy. He has been born into a country that has once again taken back control of its destiny. That portion of his inheritance that his grandfather fought for was not squandered by my generation. We did the most basic thing that you have to do in a nation, the most fundamental responsibility you have. We kept alive the freedoms that we've been lucky enough to inherit from our own parents, and we have now passed them on securely to the next generation. That is what a nation is. So you, the Freedom Association, carry on being optimistic, speaking up for the values that have made us what we are. Retain intact those precepts that have defined this country. And never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of our United Kingdom, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, it is our privilege to be part.